All right, so now that we're all done with App Store Connect, it's time to head back into Xcode. And first things first, just check to make sure that your bundle identifier here is exactly the same one that you used when you created your app ID. And you should be able to see that on your developer.apple.com/account under the app IDs here. So once you've checked that, the next thing is to give that capability to your Xcode project. So having the Inspo Quotes app selected, go into the Capabilities tab, and we're going to switch on in-app purchases, which is over here. So we can just toggle this switch to on, and Xcode is going to do some magic behind the scenes. And once all the checkboxes are ticked, then we are ready to go. Now, if at this point you don't actually see an in-app purchase listing under the Capabilities tab, then just quickly check to make sure that when you go to Xcode Preferences and when you go to Accounts, that you've actually got the same account that you used to set up the app ID as the one that you've got logged in to Xcode. So remember that if it's a paid developer account, the role should say something like agent and not user. And again, also checking under the General tab, make sure that you've got that team which has that same developer account checked as the team for your project. And then coming back to capabilities and trying to find that in-app purchases. So if you have multiple Apple IDs, it can get a little bit confusing. So just double check that you are logged in using the same developer Apple ID inside Xcode. So after all of those checks and balances, next step, we are ready to actually write some code. So if you have a look inside main.storyboard, we've got this table view that is going to be used to list our quotes. And our first job of the day is to show each of these quotes inside a separate cell in our table view. So I'm going to go ahead and firstly delete all of these comments that Apple has added inside view did load. And the next thing is I'm going to edit our table view data source, which is under this pragma mark here. So we're only going to have one section in our app, so I'm just going to delete this number of sections data source method. But the next one we will need because this specifies the number of rows in section. So this all should be very familiar to you given that you've done ToDoI and FlashChat. And if you haven't, I strongly recommend that you complete it because table views are a big topic and I'm not going to go into it in detail here because we've already spoken about it in excruciating detail on the previous tutorials. So I'm just going to go ahead and set this as a challenge for you. Given that you have this variable called quotes to show, which is an array that contains 6 strings, so 6 quotes, I want you to be able to set up the table view so that you see all 6 of these quotes inside the table view. Now, just ahead of time, just to mention, some of these are very long, and if they don't fit in the cell, don't worry. We're going to fix that very shortly, but just make sure that you can write some code that makes your table view display 6 cells, and each cell should have one of these quotes. So pause the video now and complete that challenge. All right, so first things first, we know that the number of rows we want is 6 because we have 6 quotes. Now, we're not going to put that in by hard coding a number 6 here because that's very, very inflexible. Instead, we want to give it as a dynamic number by calculating the count of this variable quotes to show. So instead of returning 0 here, we're going to return quotes to show dot count. And I'm going to delete this warning comment here just to clear things up a little bit. Okay, so now we're going to have a table view with 6 blank cells with this line of code. The next thing is to specify what is the data that should go into each of those cells. So I'm going to uncomment this template code that Apple has included in here, which is the table view cell for row at index path method. And this is the one that actually populates the cells. So firstly, we create a reusable cell with an identifier. And remember that the identifier I gave the prototype cells, and check what you gave your prototype cell if you created this from scratch, is over here under the attribute inspector. So I had a quote cell, and I'm just going to copy and paste that into here as the reuse identifier. So I'm going to create a whole bunch of cells reusing that prototype cell called quote cell, and then I'm going to configure the cell where it tells me to configure the cell. So firstly, I want to change the cell's text label dot text property to the text that we've got in our quotes to show variable. So it's going to be equal to quotes to show, and I'm going to pull out the item at the index of the current row. So I grab that by using index path dot row, and because we've done this millions of times, this shouldn't be hard at all. So now let's go ahead and hit run. And I'm just going to launch that on the simulator because we're not yet testing the in-app purchase part, so it doesn't really matter where we do it. All right, brilliant. So here's our Inspo Quotes app, and it's now got 6 cells, each with a quote from over here in this array. Now, as I mentioned before, each cell can only take one line of text at the moment, and it's truncating each of these quotes because they're longer than what can be fitted into each cell. So how can we fix this? Well, normally when we create a label that we want to have multiple lines of text, then we can set a property called number of lines. And we can do the same with this text label because at the end of the day, it's just a label, right? So if you take a look at UI label, then you can see it's got all of these attributes, or what we call properties. And one of this is number of lines, and it specifies the maximum number of lines the label will use to render the text, and you can set it to 0 to use as many lines as required. So that's the property that we're going to be changing. So let's close down this documentation, and then we're going to say cell.textlabel.number of lines is equal to 0. And now if we run our app again, everything is taking up as many lines as it needs to in order to display. So for example, this one's taking up 3 lines, this one's taking up 2, and nothing is cut off anymore. So brilliant. The basic functionality of our app is already there, and I've kept it really simple in terms of the styling and all of the other fancy, flashy parts. I've tried to resist adding them in because I just want us to be able to really understand what's going on with the in-app purchasing code. So hopefully at this point, all of the code that we've written is very simple and you understand it completely. If you don't, please take a look at the Flash Chat module or the To-Do module where we talk about table views and all of these delegate methods in more detail. Ideally, I want you to be really comfortable with all of this code, and you should be able to type it blindfolded before we proceed. So if there's any reviewing you need to do, go ahead and do that now. But otherwise, in the next lesson, we're going to get started adding in the in-app purchasing code. So I'll see you over there.